Hello, everyone. My name is Layla Durstein. I have the pleasure of heading up alumni engagement programs here at Williams College. We're really delighted to bring you today's program as part of our third annual Alumni Winter Study Series. In January 2021, we organized an inaugural Alumni Winter Study in celebration of the Williams Society of Alumni Bicentennial. As you may know, our society is the oldest alumni association in North America and quite possibly the world. We are united in our shared commitment to a liberal arts education, to lifelong learning, and most especially to one another. A few reminders before we get started today. If you have any questions during our talk, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen at any time. We'll have dedicated time for Q&A toward the end of the program, but you can submit your questions as you think of them. Please do reserve the chat as a space to engage with the community and share any reflections or comments you may have. Remember to select everyone in the chat dropdown so that your message can be seen by all. And please note that we are recording today's session. With that, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker. Ted Gupp is a journalist, author, and professor. He has written 3 nonfiction books: A Secret Gift, An Unknown Story of the Great Depression, Nation of Secrets, The Threat to Democracy and the American Way of Life, winner of the Goldsmith Book Prize from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and the Book of Honor, Covert Lives and Classified Deaths at the CIA, which is a New York Times and Washington Post bestseller. He is a former staff writer and editor for the Washington Post, working under Bob Woodward. He later wrote for Time magazine, covering Congress, the environment, and serving as Washington investigative correspondent. For 18 years, he also taught at Georgetown University. He has written for many publications and outlets, including National Geographic, the New York Times, Slate, the Chronicle of Higher Education, NPR, the National Review, Politico, The Guardian, the Boston Globe, and many, many others. He has been a Pulitzer finalist in national reporting and recipient of the George Polk Award and the Book of the Year Award from Investigative Reporters and Editors. He has been a grantee of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, a fellow of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, as well as Harvard Law School's Safra Center for Ethics, a Guggenheim Fellow, and a Fulbright Scholar in China and in Israel. In 2016, Ted was named a fellow at Durham University in the UK, and in the spring of 2017, he returned to Durham as writer in residence, a position he has held semi-annually since. He's taught at Johns Hopkins University and at Brown. He's been an invited speaker at the National Archives, at Harvard, the University of London, and numerous civic and scholarly organizations. He studies as an undergraduate at Brandeis and Trinity College, Dublin. Later, he studied law and was admitted to the DC bar. In the fall of 2021, Ted taught media and democracy as the George R. Gothel's Distinguished Visiting Professor of Leadership Studies here at Williams College. And this January, Williams students have had the opportunity to learn from Ted about secrecy, democracy, and the limits of American transparency. We're so appreciative that Ted was also willing to prepare this bite-sized 1-hour version of the course today, specifically designed for you, Williams alumni and friends. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ted.
Thank you very much, Layla. Well, welcome one and all. Where I am speaking to you from is a very snowy upstate New York. I must tell you that first and foremost, that I regard it as a great privilege to be able to work with students of the caliber that I find at Williams. They are extraordinary, and I'm deeply appreciative of it. I'm calling my talk with you the meta-narrative of secrecy. The first thing I want to say is that democracy obviously depends on transparency, but that transparency must be tempered by a certain realpolitik. There's still Barbary pirates on the Post, and it would be delusional, if not suicidal, to strive for absolute transparency. Absolute transparency would create as much of a dystopia as absolute secrecy. We could disagree, you and I, on where we would draw the line between transparency and secrecy. But I would argue that there are occasions where restraint of information is warranted. And I remind you and I remind myself that I am first and foremost a citizen. Finally, let me apologize for the profusion of opinions that I'll be offering. I'm under no illusion that I am right in each instant. I'm just sharing with you my views on some of these matters. I'm going to speak about secrecy, but in a much broader context than is usually dealt with, and I hope you will indulge me. I'm going to eventually get to Mar-a-Lago and Joe's garage, if you'll bear with me, but it's going to be a few moments first. To begin with, secrecy is pervasive, it's ubiquitous. Fish are not aware that they're in the sea, and we as citizens, including American citizens, are seldom aware of the degree to which we are surrounded by secrecy in all spheres, in all realms. Let's define secrecy. It's a deliberate restriction of the flow of information. Any information that is forbidden to us, withheld, parsed out to a select few, denied to others. If everyone on the planet had access to the information except for one person, it's a secret with regard to that one person. I think we could agree on that. So, yeah, the basic nature of information is that it's like water. It wants to flow, and it's a very democratic property. It wants to flow evenly across the landscape. And if you impound it, such as behind a dam, there is pressure on the other side of the dam. It wants to be out. It presses against its confinement. The restriction of information, I would argue, is both the most natural and most unnatural of acts. And it reflects and expresses some very basic human and societal instincts. So I'm going to take you to some places that are far from the CIA and the habitual places of secrecy, namely literature and art, just for a few moments, please. So let's start with the Garden of Eden. You know the story. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And what were the instructions? You can eat of any tree in the garden except for one, and that is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That is those are the first words that God speaks to man, and they are a prohibition, the creation of a secret, and provide a kind of template in the relationship between sovereign and citizen, the citizens here numbering two, eventually Adam and Eve. But if you eat of that tree, bad things will happen. Namely, you'll become aware of your nakedness, you'll be expelled from the garden, the great fall from grace, and you will suffer mortality. Pretty strict punishment for violating the strictures of secrecy. You might say that this is top secret, sensitive, compartmented information, because God obviously considered it to be potentially grave damage. So let's look at a few other historical pieces of literature and mythology that illustrate this. The myth of Prometheus, who shared fire with man against the wishes and will of the other gods, Prometheus, the Titan god. So for sharing fire with man, what happened? He was basically tied to a rock, and for eternity an eagle picked at his liver. And that fire is really reflective of the kind of property that was not intended to be shared with mortals. It's another example of that template of the sovereigns limiting the sharing of the divine knowledge or the divine property with mortals. We go from there to Pandora's box, where curiosity got the better of Pandora, and in opening the box, which was forbidden, were released all of the evils upon the earth. We have other examples, Icarus myth, the Tower of Babel. These are all essentially expressing a condemnation of setting the mortal sights too high. It's an expression of what happens with hubris and with an attempt to live as a god, to elevate oneself to the godly status, to have access to information or elements to which they were prohibited. So, what does this tell us? It tells us there's a kind of subliminal message here encouraging obedience, deference, submission, compliance. And there's the implication that if you comply, if you are obedient, if you do not seek the forbidden information, you're better off for it, right? And if you disobey, there are dire consequences, which we've seen and discussed already. There are a whole slew of common phrases and proverbs that reinforce this. Let me just offer a few. What you don't know can't hurt you. You believe that? Think of that recall on your defective pacemaker. I doubt that you would believe what you don't know can't hurt you. Think of ignorance is bliss is another one. Maybe, but it's a short-lived bliss at best. Curiosity killed the cat. The stigma attached to curiosity. All of these are contrary to the human instinct of curiosity and the seeking out of knowledge. They reduce individuals to a subservient role. In each, there's an implicit societal taboo in seeking out information for which your eyes were not intended to see. So let's take just a couple of more brief detours into the realms of secrecy to see how they might illuminate the areas of secrecy that we're more familiar with, classification, national security, et cetera. So let's look for a moment at art and literature. Suspense is a form of secrecy. When you're reading a book, when you're going to a movie, you want to know what happens, but you don't want to know. That's why we have something called a spoiler alert. A spoiler alert says, if you proceed, you will not be able to enjoy this work of art or this film fully, because you will know what happens. You don't want that. You want to wait for the denouement. You want to wait for the final act. You want to wait for the final resolution. And so there's a kind of agreement between the writer and the reader, between the director and the audience, a willful ignorance, a desire not to know so that you can enjoy the artistic experience. This is a kind of consensual secrecy. Let's think of secrecy in human relations, because this is really close to and kind of in a microcosm of what we see at the national level. Each of us has secrets, obviously. One might argue that to get to know a person is to get to know their secrets. And the secrets that we guard most jealously may be the ones that reveal the most about who we are, what we care about the most, almost by definition. And it's a kind of metaphor that works within the realm of classification. You may remember, those of you of a certain age, former director of Central Intelligence named William Colby, who was excoriated by his colleagues at the CIA for cooperating with an investigative committee and revealed what came to be known as the family jewels, which were those things which were most highly protected and guarded at the CIA. When we meet another person, we're necessarily guarded. And it's a curious word because it's exactly what we encounter in the realm of national security. Eventually, we may gain our trust or our confidence, at which point we open up. That's an interesting metaphor. That's almost like being granted a security clearance. And we share some of our secrets. Indeed, friendships and love relationships are often consummated as much by any physical act as by the sharing of secrets. It is how we grow closer to another human being. Sharing secrets is the very essence of what we mean when we talk about intimacy, a kind of I'll show you mine if you'll show me yours. And in the vernacular of the Cold War, it creates something akin to MAD, mutual assured destruction. A footnote: if you're in a relationship and suddenly there's a profusion of secrets between you, it's a good sign that the relationship is in trouble. Openness is the currency between people. It is also the currency between governed and government, reflecting trust and confidence one in the other. A superabundance of secrets is a telltale sign of alienation in both the personal and the public realms. Okay, so let us now look at the more familiar areas that we encounter secrecy, and that is government secrecy classification. Secrets, and I know that many of you, at least some of you, will have security clearances, will have had experience in the military or civilian agencies with secrecy. So I apologize if this is too dummied down, but just in the most simplistic way, classification is created based upon the degree of perceived harm that would be produced by disclosure. And they basically, whether it's confidential, secret, or top secret, whether its disclosure would cause damage, whether it would cause serious damage, or at the highest end, exceptionally grave damage. They're terms of art, but they have a context which cloaks them in meaning. So secrecy in government has given rise to a culture of secrecy, complete with its own lingo, rules, routines, rituals, customs, attitudes. I know that some of the people I've worked with over the years at the agency would take exception to this observation. They do not believe they work in a culture of secrecy, but I would refer back to what I said about the fish in the sea being unaware that they're in the sea. I do believe there is such a thing as a culture of secrecy. And in the areas that we've discussed up till now, the personal, literary, et cetera, the dynamics of secrecy can be imported. They're the same. Secrecy is a form of self-protection. It's predicated upon the view that certain knowledge is dangerous. It's distributed based on assessments of trust and on the need to know. It carries with it penalties for disclosure or for mishandling. But secrecy also has myriad unseen, unappreciated, or at the very least, underappreciated aspects. It really provides a kind of textbook case or cases in the law of unintended consequences. And I'd like to explore those for just a minute, if I may. Secrets have a cachet about them, a certain kind of magic. Those who possess them, one might think of Merlin or a sorcerer. They're possessed of a certain authority with them. No one in Washington in his day was more powerful than the former FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, the late J. Edgar Hoover. And he had secrets about everyone in Washington. Well, not everyone, but most everyone, dirt on them. And because of that, he was among the most intimidating of characters in Washington. And even those he didn't have dirt on didn't know that he didn't have dirt on them and dare not risk finding out the hard way. So he was one of the most powerful people in Washington for decades. He was, the grand poobah of secrets in Washington. Now, I want to just talk for a moment about the destructive power of secrecy and the obsession with secrecy. I absolutely, and I've said this, I absolutely believe in the need for secrecy, including in a democracy. But I do not believe that there's justification for obsessive or excessive secrecy. That is secrecy that is taken to irrational limits that cannot be based on some kind of reasonable argument or assessment. So let me give you an example of how destructive it can be. And I'll just mention one name, James Jesus Angleton, whose name will be familiar to a number of you. He was head of the CIA counterintelligence branch for 20 years, from 1954 to 1974. He took it upon himself to ferret out, to identify principally Soviet moles within the American intelligence community. Not sure he ever found any, but what he did find was the ability to destroy the careers of a lot of very innocent people at the CIA. He was paranoid, and his paranoia was contagious. And he's a classic example of the damaging impact of secrecy. And there are many who have argued, and I might join their ranks, who would argue that James Jesus Angleton did more to damage the CIA than the Soviets ever did, because he tied them up in knots. He paralyzed them. They were immobilized because of his concerns and his fears. Now, I want to just talk for a minute again about the cachet of secrets. Let's say that you're on a street corner and you see a Brinks truck go by. And you know that they're carrying guns, you know that they're steel plated, you know the windows are hermetically sealed against gas. It's a traveling fortress. The wheels are bulletproof. So what does that tell you? That tells you that there's something inside that vehicle that is of extreme value, worthy of protection. The same applies to secrets. We tend to assume that because all these extraordinary measures are taken to protect them, they also possess value. We assume that they are true. We assume that they are precious in terms of national security. When you handle them, you sign them out. When you read them in a SCIF, a secured, a sensitive compartmented information facility, a SCIF. And so, all of that cachet attaches to whatever is inside the Brinks truck by metaphor, whatever is inside the SCIF, whatever is classified. But sometimes secrets enjoy more credibility than is warranted. And if you think about the weapons of mass destruction argument that was the casus belli, the pretext for war in Iraq, that was surrounded by secrecy. It was predicated upon information from the likes of someone codenamed Curveball. That should have tipped us off at the very beginning that there was an issue. He alleged that there were chemical weapons in Iraq and being made in Iraq, a robust program, which never turned out to be true. But the problem with secrecy is that not only does it lend a kind of credence to the contents that are so heavily protected, but it also prevents the skeptics and the critics from analyzing it, from subjecting it to the kind of trials and testing to see whether or not it is credible. So if something is a little wobbly in terms of credibility and you make it a secret, you have, in a sense, enshrined it and prevented others outside from being able to see whether it is indeed true. And that's one of the problems with obsessive secrecy. I don't know if you remember the name Judith Miller. She was a reporter with the New York Times, and she dealt with national security issues and secrecy. And she had a slew of what were called exclusives at the time on the front page of the New York Times regarding these weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They were exclusive, well, in part because no one else could verify them, in part because they were not verifiable. She would publish these stories basically based on three sources. One would be an Iraqi exile. One would be a government official who spoke to the Iraqi exile, and another would be another government official who either spoke to the first government official or the Iraqi exile, which is to say that she triangulated from a single point, and that single point was dubious at best. So this is the danger of secrecy and the inability to really scrutinize it. Now, I want to talk for a moment about the dangers of overclassification, which is a very timely subject. The principle in government is, when in doubt, leave it out. You can imagine you're at a desk and you have what's called original classification authority. You're one of those people, one of those hundreds of people that can classify a document. And you're trying to figure out, does it pose a risk? Does it pose a risk of damage, serious damage, extremely grave damage? Well, your job is to make sure that if it does, it is not let out to the public, not shared with foreign enemies, etc. But if it's a close call, which way are you going to go? Do you want to be second guessed down the road when it turns out that that information you deemed was innocuous was in fact pernicious as hell and led to a terrorist attack? Do you want to be the person that's looked at after the fact as the cause of some grievous harm to the nation? Of course not. And so what's the instinct? The instinct is to classify it rather than run the risk. So anything on the margins tends to be classified. You don't want to be second guessed. And it also happens with regard to what is classified. That is, even that which is legitimately classified, if it's confidential, it has a broader dissemination. Do you want to carry the personal risk that that broader dissemination will bring havoc to the country? You do not. So what do? You may be inclined to classify it at a higher level to restrict the dissemination. So this is just kind of a human impulse of self-preservation and also preservation of the nation. It isn't just about ego or ambition or career. You also don't want to be responsible to harm to the country. And so there's this kind of conservative principle at foot in terms of classification. The net result is a sclerotic system. Information is not shared, or it's not shared sufficiently. And there becomes, because of this overclassification, it becomes top heavy. It's very difficult to navigate a ship when there's too much aboard. And that's the problem to some degree with the ship of state when there are too many secrets. Now, there was a national security advisor named George Bundy. He put it very succinctly. He said, if we guard our toothbrushes and our diamonds with equal zeal, we will lose fewer toothbrushes and more diamonds. That makes perfectly good sense. When everything is classified, nothing is classified, because classification only really works when the government exercises discipline and self-restraint. In the absence of self-restraint, when secrecy grows like kudzu and everything is secret, nothing is secret. People become desensitized. They stop thinking about classification in a meaningful way. The system discredits itself. And so this is a real problem. Officials begin to substitute their own judgment for the official determinations of classification. They'll look at a document, it'll be stamped secret or top secret, and they'll say, knowing that much of what is classified should not be classified, they look at it and they say, well, it's classified, but it shouldn't be classified. I can talk to my colleague about this. I can tell X about this because it's improperly classified. And so this becomes a problem because the more secrets there are and the more abuse of secrecy, the less protected the true secrets are, the more vulnerable they are. This becomes particularly pronounced in the higher reaches of government, where people actually have discretion and judgment in terms of secrets. So, we have very strict custodial duties and responsibilities that attach when you handle secret documents. You don't just go to the beach and read them on the chaise in the sun. You have to sign them out. You have to be cleared to sign them out. You need the clearance. You need to be reading them in the appropriate place. You need to sign them back in. These are closely classed documents, and there is a whole protocol involved, which is breached at your personal peril. That's how the system works. Which brings us to Mar-a-Lago and Joe's garage. Some of those documents are reportedly SCI, sensitive compartmented information. It is very difficult to picture those kinds of documents in a garage or in a resort. What kind of documents are they? I can't tell you specifically, because they're so highly classified. But I can tell you the kinds of documents that would be there. They would be the sort of documents that disclose what are the most sensitive things at places like the CIA and the IC, the intelligence community. It's called sources and methods. It's how the United States gets its intelligence and from whom. So when that's compromised, we potentially lose on-stream sources of information, and we potentially leave those in other countries who are putting their lives at risk to help us. We're putting their lives in severe jeopardy. Sources and methods are the family jewels, the crown jewels of the intelligence community, and they are generally classified as sensitive compartmented information. The other kind of information that one often finds in SCI is the sort of information that is related to covert actions and operations, which for obvious reasons would result in extremely grave damage to the country and to the lives of those who are taking the risks in undertaking those operations. So that's the sort of thing that's SCI, and that's why it's intended to be read only in a SCIF and not in a resort or someone's garage. The issue really is the desensitization to these documents, the idea that they can be commingled with other documents with impunity. You know, people become blasé about it. They become callous to the whole system. You know, I'm not going to defend Donald Trump's potential obstruction or lack of cooperation. I'm also not going to defend Joe Biden's taking of those documents. But I think that in both cases, they reflect the insouciance, the casualness, the blasé attitude that develops around these documents because there are so many of them. Classification is an example of less is more. The fewer documents that are classified, the easier it is to keep track of them, and the easier it is to retain respect for the system. You know, I could go through a list, and you probably are familiar with it, but there are a lot of people that just knew better, and misbehaved, mishandled these documents, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unintentionally, but in either case, the documents are put in places where they should not be. The National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, former National Security Advisor, went to the archives, a secured area of the archives, and put on his body, in his socks or wherever, sensitive documents that he attempted to take out of the archives. He knows better, and he was caught. We had former CIA Director John Deutsch, very smart guy, MIT professor. You know, he knew better. What did he do? He took home highly classified documents and placed them on his unsecured personal home computer, and he got caught. We have General Petraeus, who shared sensitive classified documents with his biographer lover. All of these individuals know better. All of them somehow thought that they could substitute their judgment for the determination of those who had been anointed to make those official determinations about what was classified and what was not. So classification, overclassification, erodes credibility. And in regards to spying, it makes it a lot easier. It makes it a lot easier because people that are inclined to play loose and fast with these documents can lie to themselves and say, well, everything's classified. It's not really that sensitive. It's not going to hurt the country if I provide these documents to someone from another nation for a payment on my mortgage or whatever the hell it is. And, you know, I see in my own line of work as an author and investigative reporter, I see people constantly substituting their own judgment for that of the official determination. You know, a number of the stories that I've written are based on highly classified material. One of them, I disclosed the existence of a top secret government relocation site under the Greenbrier, where Congress was to go in the event of a nuclear war. That was code word only. That was actually above SCI. And the individual that disclosed it to me substituted his beliefs that it should no longer be classified for those of the government. And we can discuss why I disclosed it. I will tell you that there were other sites that I learned of that I did not disclose because they didn't possess the vulnerability of the Greenbrier. There were other stories. I wrote a book about the dozens of CIA operatives that were killed undercover. Their identities were erased. Their identities were classified top secret. I disclosed who they were and how they died. In all but one case, the agency asked me to delete the final chapter, which I did because they made a compelling argument. Just a footnote, what's interesting is that after I showed a willingness to listen to their appeal, not to include that chapter in the book, they made no such appeal for any of the other chapters, which I think to some degree is a kind of oblique confirmation that the secrecy that attached to those other chapters was not warranted, was not justified. Now, the problem of overclassification has other causes as well. If you have a secret, it gives you certain access. If you alone have it, that has been the key to the kingdom. It might be into the the secret that you possess is something that others above you may need and want, and because you possess it, you are the agent that delivers it, and it inures to your benefit, your career, your ambitions, your group, your agency, your department. So there is a kind of impulse to get credit for possessing this information, and there is a kind of disincentive for sharing, because the more you share information of that sort, the more you dilute the uniqueness of your position and therefore compromise your access to those innermost circles. So that's one issue. You know, it's prestigious to be delivering the PDB, the President's Daily Brief, to the President each morning. There are a number of prestige positions as briefers, and to have that information on a close hold basis, you may not be eager to share it with others. There's also the notion that, you know, the intel community is, there are those who have said it's a misnomer to call it a community. They liken it more to children in a sandbox at the age of 3 or 4. They may not play well with others. They engage in parallel play, but are not interacting. Sometimes those at the CIA need to be reminded that they're batting for the same team as the NSA and vice versa. There are internal rivalries of an historical nature. There is some mistrust. Some of it can be personal. Some of it can be bureaucratic. But there is that tendency to look slightly askance at your brethren at another department, agency, or group. Obviously, that is counterproductive and dangerous. You know, the 9/11 report made many disclosures, and one of the most telling was the failure of the intelligence community to share information with others. And there was a problem, was identified as stovepiping. Stovepipe is a vertical as opposed to a lateral sharing of information. It's that kind of overly close holding of information and not sharing it with those that genuinely have a need to know, which can create massive vulnerabilities, as in the case of 9/11. So pursuant to 9/11, the bureaucracy came up with its own inevitable answer, which was to create more bureaucracy. This is opinion coming in, I apologize. With the creation of the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So the Director of Central Intelligence was no longer the Director of the American Intelligence Community. The ODNI now was, and the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence, was now under the ODNI. And indeed, the entire intelligence community was answerable to the ODNI. So this was an effort to centralize and integrate intelligence. I think it has had mixed results. Under the Homeland Security, there was an organization set up with the acronym ISE, which stood for what was it? The sharing environment was the SE of it, and the ISE information sharing environment. It didn't even have a leader for some time. I don't know how successful it was, because part of the issue, almost everyone that I'm referring to and describing is patriotic to the core, but they're human and they work within organizations that have their own cultures. And sometimes the need and the desire to share runs counter to the cultures of those places. So the ISE has its work cut out for it, even after all these years post 9/11. Then I would like to just address the problem of disinformation and misinformation and conspiracies. It may seem off point to a discussion of secrecy, but I would argue it is not. Secrecy is an omission of information from the public, from decision makers. It's a void, and nature abhors a vacuum. Where information is not available, something else rushes in to fill its place. And too often that can be conspiracy theories, it can be disinformation. So the more that we have secrecy, the more we have an environment which is fertile for conspiracy theories and disinformation. We can go back to the Warren Commission and the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the grassy knoll and all the conspiracies that came out of that. The commission withheld much of what it learned and many of its details for years and years. And during that whole time, what it did essentially was water the ground for one conspiracy theory after another. We saw it post 9/11 with the withholding of information about the Saudis. That fueled more conspiracies. We saw it with the Steele dossier about Donald Trump, and that set off a whole slew of conspiracy theories and paranoia. It's with conspiracies like this, it's very fertile ground for the likes of a Marjorie Taylor Greene. Information tends in that forward. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. You think about the deals that Kevin McCarthy made to become speaker, the backdoor deals. We don't know what they were. They were secret. We can imagine, and we can imagine the worst. But this is what happens. These conspiracies rush in the void that's created by secrecy. So I have maybe 3 minutes more, and I wasn't going to do this, but I'll just take those 3 minutes to mention a few of the post 9/11 things about secrecy that I would mention. One is in terms of secrecy that there has been a reallocation of resources post 9/11. Before 9/11, particularly in the Cold War, the enemy was based in, our adversaries were based in capitals, and so our intelligence operatives were largely based in capitals. That's where our station chiefs were. Our bases were in major cities, our intelligence community people. And post 9/11, and in the run-up to 9/11, we realized that the world was that one of the great threats was terrorism. Terrorism is much more fragmentary. It's much more finely atomized, and terrorists generally don't reside in capitals. They reside in the bush and the hinterlands, which meant that the intelligence community had to adjust and adapt to not the luxury life of the capital, but the life in the bush, and not the safeties of embassy cover, which mean if you're discovered, you're expelled, but rather the harsher realities of being a non-official cover, which means if you're exposed, you can be imprisoned or worse. So there are more knocks because official cover is not going to be of any use in terms of penetrating terrorist cells. So that's one development, and I apologize, I'm rushing through this, but time is running. The greatest danger related to intel and secrecy right now is politicization, I would argue. Politicization on the right and the left, and the cherry picking of intel. I'm much more afraid of politicians bending intel to their will than I am of the intel being inaccurate. Most of the intel community is wise enough that when they present their findings in the National Intelligence Estimate and elsewhere, they hedge their bets, that they recognize and realize that they're not certain, and they offer counter narratives oftentimes. But politicians that have their own agendas are less inclined to do so. They're more inclined to cherry pick, to confirm and reaffirm the conclusions that they want to reach, and they ignore that information which doesn't meet their bias. So that is a great concern. So let me just see here. I just close with Louis D. Brandeis and that too often quoted line, too often quoted because it's so true, which is that sunlight is the disinfectant, that democracies thrive on transparency. They need to accept the reality that some things need to be secret, but they have a responsibility and obligation to insist that the restraints and constraints on the flow of information are rational and not obsessive. That's it. And now I'm super eager to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ted. That was so informative. We do have a number of questions in the queue, and I'll go ahead and start firing some of those off. So Les Johnson, class of 85, asks, how often are documents reviewed for lower classification and or declassification?
It's a good question. I can't give you the specifics because they change routinely. But each administration, there's an effort to declassify. I mean, it's incumbent upon the national security apparatus to declassify. It isn't just because they love transparency and democracy, it's because otherwise it all becomes unmanageable. And so there are review processes built in, and it depends on the nature of the materials. If they're nuclear in nature, it might be a longer time before it undergoes a declassification. And the declassification review process has a kind of built-in presumption that after 10 years or 15 years, this or that document will be reviewed for declassification and be declassified. But it's only a presumption, and that presumption can be overruled and often is if the sensitivity is still attached to the material.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Daniel Levy asks, would you comment on the psychological profiles of those who hold tremendous amounts of classified material? I gather that you have interviewed many. As someone who had a TS clearance, I can tell you that even getting read in is terrifying at first. How would you group the different attitudes of those who have a need to know classified information?
That's a great question. Frankly, I'd like to interview you. I think that it's a diverse group. I think it's really easy to paint with a broad brush, but these people are very diverse. As I say, I believe they are at core patriotic and concerned with national security. There are some who gain the reputation, like an individual I knew at the CIA, whose nickname was Dr. No. And he basically started with the premise that the public had the right not to know nothing, basically. To treat them like mushrooms and let them grow in the dark. That was really basically his attitude. And there are others who come at it from a very different and more restrained position that if you can't justify it, you need to declassify it, or you don't classify it in the first place. But there's also a difference between the people that classify and the people that work with the classified material in terms of attitude. The people that work with the classified material in the field recognize that their lives may depend on it. The people that have original classification authority that work in an air-conditioned office may have a very different view of it, and I don't mean to say this disrespectfully, but a more bureaucratic sense as to how these documents should be handled. That's always the difference between the desk and the field. I think that it's imperative that the system be routinely reviewed if it is to work, because otherwise what you're going to have is increasingly people who take the documents home, who abuse the system, and who erode confidence in it, and that doesn't serve anyone's interest. whether you're liberal or conservative, it doesn't matter. I think as an American, as a citizen, you want the system to work. And if you want it to work, you have to exercise judgment and restraint. But I'm sure, given your experience, that was probably an unsatisfactory and rudimentary response.
It's informative, though, too, for those of us that hold no clearances. So James Holmes asks, or says, you have mentioned penalties for disclosing secrets. Are there any informal or formal penalties for creating secrets over classifying information?
That's a great question. That's part of the problem, is that all the incentives flow one way. There are no real disincentives for overclassification. I mean, I guess if you are really out of control and you catch the attention of your peers and colleagues, you may do yourself damage and may find yourself under scrutiny. But I've not heard of that situation. The general rule of thumb is, when in doubt, leave it out, and you're not going to get called generally for overclassification. Now, there is a gauntlet that you have to run in reaching these decisions. There's certain boxes that need to be checkmarked, and there's certain historical guidelines that help you in this decision making. Some of them are easy. If you're talking about actionable intelligence that influences actions in the field, that's a no-brainer. But if you're talking about, for example, the oldest classified document at the United States Archives was classified in 1917, and it wasn't declassified until about 2001. And it was the formula that the Kaiser and Germany used for invisible ink in the First World War. Now, that's crazy. I mean, we don't use invisible ink anymore. And why should that be classified? Well, the answer and the argument is the slippery slope. That is, that a lot of folks in intelligence and in classification worry about the slippery slope. If you give an inch, you give a mile. If you allow this to go out, then how do you defend the next decision that's farther down the slope? And so they hold the line too tightly.
Perfect. And then Kevin asks, and I think this may be our last question that we have time for, can you tell us a bit about the assignments that you gave your students to get them to engage with the material? If you just want to talk a bit about your winter study class.
I wish we had another hour. Yeah, I love my students. They're fabulous. They went out. I assigned them all kinds of things. I assigned them, for example, I assigned them secrecy involving Operation Northwoods, which was a pretext for invading Cuba. I assigned them the second Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was classified by the NSA, the historical finding that it was a pretext and it was fabricated. I assigned them the sinking of the Maine and how that was covered. I assigned them the Glomar Explorer, which was the Howard Hughes raising of a Soviet submarine with nuclear weapons and the bodies of Soviet seamen on board. And then each of them brings a piece of the mosaic, and then when they come to class, they give brief presentations of these things, and then we look at kind of the collective lesson that we can draw from them. So that's sort of the pattern of our assignments.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, Ted, for your time. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone in the audience did as well. And certainly the students here at Williams are so lucky to have benefited from your visiting professorship as well as your winter study this year. I hope you'll be back at Williams for more.
I hope so too.
And yeah, and for those of you that didn't have, you submitted a question, but we just didn't have time to get to it today. I will share those with Ted, and he may be able to follow up on some of that. But we hope that you'll join us. We have 2 more alumni winter study sessions this January, and I'll go ahead and put the link to register in the chat so you have that. But we look forward to seeing you. And thanks again to Ted. Take good care.
Thank you.